Yeah, I want to talk about new cities, old cities, and start with a very brief history. So this is Paris a century ago. It was crowded, noisy, polluted, vibrant, wonderful. And exactly 100 years ago, 1925, Le Corbusier proposed to replace the messiness of historic Paris with a grid of pristine towers in a green space. Fortunately, this wasn't built. But Brasilia, 30 years later, Oscar Niemeyer and Costa, they designed Brasilia to impose order and control. What they failed to do was address human activity, community, spontaneity. And then Sangdong in South Korea was conceived as the ultimate smart city a few years later, generally seen as a social failure, focusing on so-called smart technology rather than the needs of humans.
Yeah.
New cities, they're great because they don't have the complex constraints of existing cities, far more freedom to innovate, but most cities really struggle to replicate the kind of vibrancy and complexity that you find in historic places like Paris, that are shaped by literally thousands of people and their contributions over generations. So recent projects, like this project in Bhutan, try to put people first. You can see the people in the animation here. But the question is, do these renderings actually reflect the kind of human behavior that you'll actually find in real life? I just want to talk about a project we finished last week. It's a proposal for a new island development in Shanghai. It's a highly complex, vertical, high-density city. And of course, the question is, how could you possibly understand this and model human dynamics, particularly when neighborhoods are up in the air? So what we're doing is modeling where people live, work, play, learn, shop, interact, the pathways they choose, how views and light and openness, etc., impact the experience. And we try to quantify the performance of this development. We use agent-based modeling. Just a really simple example, people get up in the morning, they have opportunities for different activities. At lunchtime, maybe they go to the park, and then for dinner, they have other opportunities, etc. So we actually have developed like 300 unique profiles with thousands of choices. And in this community, we will populate this 3D virtual environment with about 60,000 people. Millions and millions of possible choices. This is the sandbox that we built to test the access to different amenities, and you see people going up and down the elevators. We can look at the choices people make: stair, elevator, escalator. If you're a mother with a baby carriage, you're not likely to take the stairs or the escalators, etc. And then we can take a project like we're working on in Fuxing, and if we can label all of the spaces, and we have the demographic profiles, we can populate that model with agents, and then collect data, just like you would collect data from mobile phone use. And we could, for example, say that 68% of the people in this community have 5-minute access to all the amenities they need in daily life. And then we like to quantify the performance using these radar plots. This is too complex to explain in detail, but you can see this might be the initial performance, then you do a second iteration, you can use generative tools to help optimize it, and then eventually you achieve something like harmony. Existing cities like San Francisco, really the same process applies. In this case, we're picking a neighborhood for a deep dive. We can now use telecom data because people actually live here, unlike a new city. And we can see where people live and work and how they get access to amenities, how they commute in and out, what modes they use. Then we can look at transformation. We can look at what's the impact of new housing, or new streetscapes, new mobility modes, even new energy production facilities, etc. transformation. Then we can look at predictions. So we use a kind of agent-based modeling and the metrics I described to quantify each of these potential interventions. But of course, unless you bring the community along and sort of counter the NIMBY opposition to development, very little will happen. So we build these consensus platforms to help people reach a shared vision of the future. And governance is key. I mean, zoning has really become the operating system of cities. It largely determines where people live and work, and it's broken. It's obsolete, it's 100 years old, it's static. But one thing zoning does tend to do is to have effective incentives. So this is the Seagram's built in 1958. You put in a plaza, so the next zoning ordinance gave developers an incentive to build plazas, and almost overnight every developer was putting in plazas. So we're looking at moving away from the sort of static, broken zoning system to something that's much more dynamic and incentive-based, to kind of augmented intelligence, and just briefly how we do this. We start with a deep dive into the performance of the community, our jobs and housing and line, for example. Then we're developing algorithms, call it an AI. This could be an AI advisor or supervisor that can create incentives in ranked order according to the values of the community. Could be hundreds of those. Maybe a community center is the top of the list. This goes to the community, to the supervisors. They can accept what the machine recommends or revise it, etc. The developer can pick from this list, could be running a financial pro forma, and then all this can get recalculated, and the next project has a different list of incentives. So, in summary, what we're doing is building feedback mechanisms into human ecosystems that are analogous to what you find in a natural ecosystem to achieve what you might call civic homeostasis. So Peter, that's a quick summary of what we're thinking.
That's a great overview, and Kent is also our partner here in San Francisco, where we're at once helping people work through the new zoning plan and also, perhaps disruptively, beginning to look at how to apply some of these new governance ideas in a city that could use that for fundamental change. So Kent, stick around, and Sarah, let's go over to you. You're with NEOM and the Line. This has to be one of the most ambitious projects in the world today. And kind of when people think about it, they think of it as a major architectural project. But as you and I were talking about, if this had been done 10 years ago, it might have been a smart city. But now you're looking at human dynamics, the same kind of modeling that Kent's talking about. So give us a sense for what NEOM is about and the kind of the work that you're doing and what that journey has been.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly.
Perfect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to introduce you to a little bit about NEOM and the Line, potentially actually just speaking a little bit more about the Line specifically given my role. So you rightly said it, so Peter, if this was a city that was designed about 10, 20 years ago, the technology would have been very, very different. And I really can't see anyone on the screen, so please pardon if there's any questions that come from the audience. So now that we're thinking about, the Line, it's intended to be, the first cognitive city that's ever built and very human-centric. And of course, in order for us to be doing that, it's very much based on what sort of AI, what sort of cognition, what sort of technologies that we can use to really build a city that has never been conceived before. The Line is a vertical city. It's a linear and a vertical city. To create sort of three-dimensionally, and I'm going to go through some of those concepts as we kind of go through some of the ideas that we've developed. But really, when we're thinking, and I love the conversation previously that I heard some of the panelists before, you talk a lot about, you shouldn't expect people to change when you change the environment. So that's where we bring in some of the technology that Kent has been talking about, the agent-based modeling. So what about creating communities that we bring back and foster, the raising kids, connections, walkable neighborhoods, creating spaces that really encourage healthy behaviors and so forth in a space and in a city that has never been built before. So to give you a bit of an introduction, the Line is a city that goes all the way from the coast to the upper reaches. It's 170 kilometers. city that's intended to be to house 9 million population. It's 500 meters high and 200 meters wide only. And with that, there's, the intention was, how do we create a sustainable and a human-centric urban model that could house this 9 million population? And we went through several models, we went through so many different ideas. And as you know, the idea of a linear city is not a new one, it's been conceived before. But something that has not been done before is this idea of a vertical city. So we were suddenly able to open up a whole new dimension. And really that's thanks to the technologies that we have, we are able to go vertically in the sky and so forth. And in this process, Peter, we've learned so much about what does it mean for a community? What does it mean for the process? How do we conceive communities? How do we create cities all the way from the scratch? And so the idea was actually quite simple. We said if you take a city like, New York, for example, what we ended up doing is that we flipped, if you take the whole grid of the city, and we flipped it up and condensed the whole city, suddenly you're creating something that we call a city in the park rather than constantly thinking of a park in the city. And that's the most simplistic way of explaining what that city and the sort of principles that really encompass what we're trying to achieve here. So once we started doing, condensing the city and creating this sort of grid, and this three-dimensional aspect started emerging, you can see how we are able to provide some sort of principles into urbanism. Now we're suddenly able to provide immediate access to nature. How are we able to create, equitable views all the way across? We were talking previously about walkable neighborhoods. If we suddenly start multiplying the three-dimensionality of the city and you constantly have multiple ground planes, you're able to provide more proximity, and that's something that we're calling as hyper-proximity into the city. So what we then did, we started phasing the line, and a lot of you will be familiar with this, with the Hidden Marina, potentially, which is the first phase of the line. And this is really where my focus has been in the project of designing the first phase of it. It's 182,000 population, 2.4 kilometers long, and with the GFA or BUA, we use the metrics here, 12.8 square meters, with over 60% of it is actually residential. To give you an idea, those lines that you see here, those neighborhoods, or that one module, is actually the width of Central Park. That's the size of the city, one of the modules or one of the neighborhoods that we're really trying to create. So you can imagine with the width of 200 meters, that's actually the width of Central Park, and 200 meters depth and the 500 meters high. And it's actually taller than the tallest tower that overlooks Central Park. With that, you can imagine the amount of complexity that we're going to be dealing with. The cities today, you're talking about San Francisco, a lot of the conversations has been around existing cities. There is so much inherent complexity within the existing city. But actually, when you start adding another dimension and multiplying those ground planes, you can only imagine what sort of problems we would be facing when designing this. So what did we do? A lot of the work, in order for us to be able to conceive this, we created this sort of almost an engine that's behind this vision. And I really tried to create this summary slide just for the sake of this conversation to try and encapsulate. You've given me an impossible task to, put in 6 years worth of work into, 5 minutes into a conversation. But really the idea here is how do we work across the very multidisciplinaries? We've got over 29 different disciplines that are working with us. And with that, we kind of consolidated down to sort of the architects, the consultants, the planners, and so forth. We've provided the basis of design. So this is what is this site, what is the geometry, what is the KPIs, and what is that vision that really sits behind it? What is the livability principles? So a lot of this concept comes from this idea of zero gravity urbanism. And for another conversation, we'll be more than happy to kind of go through it, but really this three-dimensional living aspect to it. And of course, there's a development program that really sort of encompasses what sort of land uses, what sort of livability, what sort of economics I need to have be underpinning the whole entire city. So this AI and digital tools that we've created have really become this sort of operational engine into the entire city for how we integrate every single layer and very quickly try and accelerate some of this decision making that we're trying to go through. And so the architecture, we started, with some sort of inputs. We started with the architecture, the basic foundations of the city. What is this urban form that we're going through? Then the design management aspect of things, and the public realm, a very, very, very complex topic. The lighting design, the landscape, the signage, wayfinding, the cognitive cities, the public art community, and so forth. But what I'm going to focus on is the livability aspect, because that's actually where a lot of cities really tend to fail in terms of imagining what kind of livability we're going to be creating there. So what we work with is this is where technology actually and AI, very different AI tools became handy for us. One of the things is how do we imagine different characters? So in a city that, when you're walking from in Manhattan, for example, you go to lower Manhattan, you go to upper Manhattan, every part of that city comes with a very different character. And that evolves over, tens and some of them over 100 years in time to kind of develop a certain character. And of course, boundaries shift, but characters always somehow really built from the people. And that takes years to build. And so then we use something called world building. And this is where you start imagining worlds. And this is where you really start tapping into, if I close my eyes and I'm walking through a particular neighborhood, what are the different sounds that are really, and the transport or mobility patterns that really sort of dictate what sort of imagination I'm going to have or what sort of lifestyle I'm going to have in a particular neighborhood. So imagine if you're walking in Central Park and you close your eyes, you can hear the cyclist, you can hear the walking, you can hear the running, you can hear the chirping, you can hear all sorts of things. But if I'm in Lower Manhattan, a very different mobility pattern. So how do we start layering some of those aspects in order to really start, we talked about generative AI, how do we start really creating environments that help us imagine what kind of designs we want to be creating? Then the agent-based modeling, which Kent talked a lot about in terms of how do people move in the city. And of course, the concept that really inspired us to think differently, particularly in a three-dimensional city, is this idea of neo-urbanism. It's an emerging field, and I'll talk a little bit about that in the coming slides. Then you have something about economic spatial planning. What does it look like with the first house owners, second home owners, and so forth. Then you have urban system modeling, then the corner cities I've mentioned, and mobilities and logistics, and what do those dynamics look like? Then it goes into this iterative process in a digital model. This is a real-time, data interconnected, traceable model that updates and constantly refines the findings and informs what sort of decisions we're going to have from an architecture perspective, from a design management perspective, from a public realm perspective, sustainability, infrastructure, and so forth. And ultimately, that's how we ended up with a design that is validated, optimized, and executed for a city that has never been, as I mentioned before, built before. So for the sake of this discussion, if we were to go into this, and I'm just going to share some of those ideas for how this public realm works within the city. And really, if you start thinking about those multiple ground planes, what are those districts? And there's so much science and so much, urbanism, based principles that really underpin a lot of the images or this scenery that you see here. But really, and sort of the mobility patterns and how you move in the city, where is the greenery, how do you look out? When you're looking in the city and you're walking through the city, what sort of emotions are instigated when you're on the lower levels, when you're on 150 and the 300 and 400 and ultimately the 500. But something that's really important to us that we discovered, and actually something in this whole process, the more we discover it, the more we ask questions. So what it got pinned down to when it comes to the public realm, and public realm is so important that we always nail in cities. And I heard you talk about the parklets concept, a very interesting concept, and I've seen it a lot happen in Sydney, in very different parts of Sydney. But really, it really got pinned down to very specific 8 sort of drivers. One is the program. So what kind of land use, what kind of parks, what kind of hospitals, what kind of amenities are you going to be scattering in every part of the city? And so then we went into this idea of the light design. As you can imagine, this is a 3-dimensional city, and it's so important that we understand where are the places that are heavily lit, where are the places that are more darker spaces, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with the sort of more shadier spaces, but it creates a very different character, and celebrating those characters. In the same way, if you're walking in Manhattan, there's places that are a little bit more shadier and other places that are very much exposed. And being a city in the desert with very high, UV rays, that was kind of important to kind of explore. And of course, from that, then we understood what sort of landscapes can grow with these environments. There's very particular micro environments that we're creating within the line. So what are those environments? How do we inspire new environments and microclimates and different planting escapes that exist within there? And then we went into something that's called the world building, which I talked a lot about. This is very much underpinned under so much research. And one day we could share some of those ideas with you, but so much research into sort of this type of storytelling that gets underpinned by each of the neighborhoods. The agent-based modeling Kent talked a lot about, and the public art strategy. So when we're walking into a city, how do we create characters through the public art? The cognitive city strategy, but not your smart city strategy, but understanding what is a sort of cognition that really links people to the infrastructure, to the services, and so forth. And neurourbanism, I cannot emphasize how important and fundamentally eye-opening this was to us. And the idea here is, how do we, as we're walking through spaces, and this is something that we experience all, anywhere in any city really, but it's very much heightened when we're working with the three-dimensional cities. If you're looking up, there's very different emotions that, that are instigated by the brain and the neurons in the brain. And when you're looking down, there's very different emotions. And when you're going up the strings or sort of the districts that we have, there's also very different emotions. So
Sarah, we need to do one day
a
whole day on this, because there's so much here. I know we need to get on to Tom. I've got one quick question for you before we go on. This incredible tool set that you've built that you're using, is that anything that the organization plans on commercializing for other cities to use? Because it looks like you've done a huge amount of research here.
A lot. And this is something that we haven't really, you're really getting a bit of a really sort of first look at some of the stuff that we have been doing, and this doesn't even scratch the surface. We work very closely with a lot of consultants, a lot of researchers on a lot of different things, and each of those actually becomes almost a thesis. And how do you encapsulate a lot of this information into sort of, each of those need an hour, if I'm being honest. And of course, a lot of this agent-based modeling then informs all of these journeys. I'm going to skip through very quickly through all of this, and I will leave it at that.
I mean, you've made such a great case for agent-based modeling, in this case, to look at a population that doesn't even exist yet. Here in San Francisco, we have lots of different populations that are contentious, and Kent, we're excited about modeling our different populations to represent perhaps underrepresented people with this technology. It's a great opportunity. Let's move on to Tom. You represent kind of a third approach here, which is Telosa. Telosa is conceived of as a North American city with kind of the best of sustainability, but also some very interesting economic ideas, and getting to the core of something that Ben brought up earlier, which are the land economics and the relationship between land and wealth. So perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about both Telosa's idea and your new approach to economics.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Should I share my slides? Is that what we're doing?
Oh, I can, if you want, you can do them, or I've got a loop here that I could run, and you could just get started.
That's fine. I can do it.
Say again. What did he say? He's going to do it. Okay, good. Go ahead. That's not right. Hold it. How do we get? There we go. You're on.
Okay, perfect. So excellent. So Telosa is I'm the least technical person here, so I'll just caveat that from the beginning. So Telosa is the vision and brainchild of Mark Laurie, who's a tech entrepreneur and innovator. And there's an old adage among urban planners that cities are people. And we took that to heart in studying how to approach building a new city from scratch. And essentially, we're building this city that's focused on people by creating a higher quality of life, greater opportunity, and shared prosperity for everything. And for everyone, excuse me. And why is this so important? In 2007, the population of the Earth passed 50% in urban areas. So for the first time in history, there were more than half the population of the Earth living in cities. And in fact, this is projected to go up to over 90% by the year 2100. And of course, AI being a theme here is a very big driver of that process. So the unmistakable conclusion is that the future of cities is the future of humanity. So by starting with a clean slate, we're empowered to develop innovative ideas that will serve as a blueprint for other new cities, as well as help existing cities whose budget constraints do not allow them to develop new solutions for current problems. Which is something you had previously mentioned, and I think that's a very important part of our mission as well. So Telosa Telosa comes from the word telos, which is the Greek word for the ultimate aim or highest purpose. And we're a very purpose-driven city, focused on people. This is our why, if you want. And the Greeks also had another idea that was very interesting. They believed that citizens could not reach their fullest potential through individual success alone, but it required living in a flourishing society as well as being a successful individual who contributed. And those who didn't give back, they had a word for it. They called them idiota. I'll leave you to work that out, the root word of that. So the focus on people, begun by building a community of concerned citizens that believed in Marx's vision and wanted to help create a more equitable and sustainable future. And by the way, every new city project that we studied, which did not succeed, failed because they focused on many other things other than people. In fact, they ignored the input and insights of the community in their decision making and spent a lot of money to achieve very little. So one of the core other ways that we work on and focus on people is a concept called equitism, which is, I believe you were referring to. So equitism is a new social and economic model for sustainable growth and shared prosperity. It utilizes a concept called land value return, which was first popularized by Henry George in the late 19th century. And basically, the idea is the land price appreciation accrues to a nonprofit foundation, then reinvests those resources back into the community through education, healthcare, housing, and jobs and training, another area that's being deeply affected by AI. What this does is it creates a virtuous circle of growth and shared prosperity, ultimately leading to flourishing. You know, one of the major discoveries that we made during this whole process, literally at the very beginning, was in looking at the challenges of existing cities and cities in general. Land values are typically captured by a very small group of people who then take a large portion of those gains out of the city. This drains the community of precious resources that are needed for growth and thriving, and it also is a double whammy because it pushes up prices and essentially makes cities unlivable for much of the population. And we see that in a lot of the major cities in the US today. Equitism solves this problem. Our approach has been basically to find the best practices from around the world and throughout history, things that have actually worked and been applied in real world circumstances. Whether that's sustainable design, construction methods, construction materials, all the way to governance and city services. And our goal here is to create world-class solutions in every single category that we would make openly available to new and existing cities as well. You know, in a broad sense, there are three major categories that we focus on: physical infrastructure, social infrastructure, and economic infrastructure. In every successful city that we have looked at throughout history and on Earth today, there was a very strong balance of those three things working together in harmony to create the flourishing that we're all looking to accomplish. Lastly, there's one area of special concentration that we have been working on for the last 2 years, and that is the idea of community. The empirical research is very clear that in urban areas with strong sense of community, social connections, and social capital, they are healthier, happier, safer, better governed, and more prosperous than those without these strong bonds. And the research also shows that the height of community in America was 60 years ago. Now, in 2025, we don't interact and connect the same way that we do in the 1950s and the 1960s. So what is needed is what we call Community 2.0, which is a method of restoring robust community connections in an age of the internet, social media, and smartphones. We've also developed a Community Connections Index, which allows us to, with one of our close partners at Polco, to help towns and cities measure their community bonds and social capital to see where they're strong and where they also need improvement. So Telosa, city for everyone, where higher quality of life, greater opportunity, shared prosperity can all work together to lead to a more equitable, sustainable future for humankind.
Thanks. You know, what I'm struck by in each of your talks is your cities are frontier cities, and because they're new and ambitious, they're doing great research and they're imagining kind of what's possible. So I have a question both for you, Tom, and perhaps for Kent, which is, what is it that we can learn from these that we can bring to our existing cities? For example, with all the Telosa stuff, how might that inform our city or communities, other communities in the U.S.? And Kent, I know you've given thought to, are there ways of creating equality with land or tokenization or ways of earning some form of wealth other than just either paying rent or owning? So the question really is, what can all the rest of our cities learn from all this advanced work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, well, I would say that the concept that Tom's talking about, equitism, based on Henry George, is, you know, the pure idea of that is best applied in, you know, in a new city. But a variation of that is related to the algorithmic zoning, where, you know, the city controls billions, probably trillions of dollars of wealth, cities in this country, through their land use regulations, zoning, approvals, etc. But it's an untapped resource. There's no reason why cities could not channel money into an endowment, for example, or a process of fractional ownership in exchange for increased floor area ratios in zoning reform. And that would be a kind of equitism that could be deployed in existing cities with the existing, you know, land ownership structures.
And Tom, is the remit of Telosa to singularly build Telosa, or to take these ideas and kind of share them with the world so that other places can explore new forms of community, new forms of equitism and such?
Oh, absolutely. We're sharing the ideas freely with everyone, and you know, we're talking with cities in Bhutan, as you mentioned in the intro, and also other cities around the world. So we're openly sharing that, and Polka works with a lot of local cities, the ICMA. So we're working with a lot of existing cities to develop some of these ideas, especially with the Community Connections Index. And, you know, to piggyback on something that Kent said, you know, Singapore owns the government of Singapore owns 90% of the land. And they are arguably one of the best city growth stories and turnaround stories. And the first thing that they did back in the mid-60s when they gained independence, Britain basically kicked them out of the empire, and the Malaysians voted to not accept them unanimously, to not accept them into their country. They tore down the dilapidated workforce housing, and they rebuilt the workforce housing for safe, clean places for their workers to live. So there's a lot of ideas. You know, you were mentioning the park idea. There was a pilot project in Philadelphia where they went to abandoned lots, and they turned these abandoned lots into little parks. And the level of violence declined 20 to 30%. And they had a control group where the lots weren't reclamated. And there's a lot of examples that were, and that's just one of many, but there's a lot of examples around the world where people were doing really good things. And it doesn't cost a lot of money. It just takes a new way of thinking of the situation. And so that's kind of the value of what we're doing. And of course, you know, Kent's great work in designing really wonderful models for zoning, I think, is very important as well.
You may be getting an inkling on why we think it's so important to build a city science lab in San Francisco, where we have so much talent, ability to experiment. We have the nation's greatest portfolio of urban problems with 40% vacancy and such. So this is really a great place to do it. And Sarah, I know you spend time between Riyadh and here, so I'd love to invite you when you're back in the Bay Area to perhaps spend some time with our community and in greater depth go through some of the things you've exposed us to today, because there are an awful lot of people in our AI and agent modeling community that would be thrilled, and I think these ideas animated in our city would be terrific. So I want to thank everybody.